coming. Those of us who are speaking on the third day of this conference find ourselves in an especially difficult position. This was wonderfully expressed yesterday by Professor Cullen from Rhodes College. He said, everything has already been said, but not everyone has said it. So Chris and I have an opportunity to add to the course. If there is any contribution in what follows, it is my attempt to highlight the uniqueness of the St. John's interpretation of liberal education, to introduce some and remind others of the history of the origination of the Great Books program at the college, and more importantly, to encourage us all to reflect on the art of the liberal arts. How are we doing with this? Good? 73 years ago, in what has to be one of the most extraordinary reports by a college president to a board of visitors and governors, the first president of the new program at St. John's College, Stringfellow Barr, expressed his concern about the prospect for continued liberty of the democratic peoples, specifically our own, whose liberty at that very moment was threatened by a world war. In societies directed by laws, he writes, liberty can consist only in the power of doing what we ought to will, and in not being constrained to do what we ought not to do. Liberty was conceived as the precious right to act justly towards other men. In short, he thought we must think differently about liberty than we customarily do. Think of it as a positive power rather than as a negative notion, as freedom to exercise good judgment and to act responsibly rather than mere freedom from external constraint. But then, in a moment of dark reflection, he adds, perhaps liberty is not the word in 1941 to bring us back to ourselves. Perhaps justice might rouse an echo in our hearts. Certainly the word democracy does not seem any longer to move us. In addition to significant events abroad, equally significant changes were taking place at home in our language. Words, and not just words, fundamental ideas seem to have lost their meaning. Liberty, justice, democracy. Such words no longer moved the heart in 1941. He continues, Hitler and Mussolini repeatedly declared, long before the shooting began, that democracy was decadent. This leads Mr. Barr to a painful prospect. It is just possible that democracy as we have known it really is dead, and that Hitler is proving it. But, Mr. Barr asserts, what Hitler cannot teach, because it is not true, is that the ideas that once made democracy great are also decadent. Ideas do not decay, but people's understanding of them can decay. And literally as sure as shooting, he says, a free republic cannot defend itself against aggressive tyranny unless its citizens understand those ideas which make men free and guard their freedom. No free republic can fight off tyranny unless its citizens love more than their cut. The question here is the underlying reason for our vulnerability. Mr. Barr argues that it is the loss of those democratic ideas which has paralyzed the will of the American Republic as it had paralyzed the will of the peoples Hitler had already subjugated. If this report numbers the consequences of that loss to a board of visitors and governors, he continues, it is because of the inescapable connection between the decay of liberal education and the decay of liberal government. The inescapable connection between the decay of liberal education and the decay of liberal government. These same forefathers of ours, who could use words like justice and liberty and make them bear meaning, were deeply aware that no government by reflection and choice could hope to stand unless its citizens received the sort of liberal education that would enable them to choose by the light of the understanding. The task of disciplining and strengthening the intellectual powers of men, he says, has been delegated to the colleges of liberal arts. He then elaborates, in an important sense, the Bill of Rights is negative. Nowhere does it, can it, or should it tell us either the list of things we ought to do or how to do them. That, in their opinion, was the proper business of liberal education. That, in their opinion, was an arduous process, for it is harder to develop in men their native powers of self-control, their native powers of thinking through, their native powers to follow up with courageous and just action than it is to drive them with club and carrot. Tyrants forbid citizens to do their duty as free men. Free governments permits them to do it. Liberal education enables them to do it. There are many things of note about this report. Most conspicuous is the extraordinary expectation for liberal education, and by extension for this small college, and by extension further for us individually. As presented here, ideas are a principal source of human strength. They are never mere ideas. And the loss of those ideas results in a loss of strength that shows itself in our excessive vulnerability to external force. According to Mr. Barr, liberal arts colleges thus have an obligation to complete the work of Republican governments. As language tends to become empty of original significations, so our culture and our lives become shadows of their former selves. Mr. Barr saw liberal education as reversing this historical process and as restoring meaningful signification to speech and thence to our lives. Education in this sense would be enabling, encouraging, and finally ennobling. For those who do not remember, let me try to present the magnitude of those crises. Simply put, there are times, too frequent to be sure, when life becomes so overwhelmingly complex, not to say disorienting and precarious, that it is necessary to step back and think things through from the beginning. World War I was such a time, World War II another. In particular, these two global crises raised new specters and threats. The wars themselves introduced horrific new strategies, mustard gas, saturation bombing of non-combatants, and were soon to introduce atomic weaponry and Auschwitzes. The human carnage of these wars was unprecedented. The inhumanity of man seemed to have reached new heights. The horrific novelty and inhuman efficiency with which human beings were systematically slaughtered and turned into smoke took away our breath and exposed at the same time for all to see the human ambiguity of technology that seemed only to aid and abet the basest human ends. This paralleled the rise of mass society with its dilution of human dignity in seas of numbers, and its concomitant statistical methodologies with their indiscriminate tendency toward low denominators. Along with these came the traditional worries about democracy, its tendency to mediocrity, its reduction of judgment to opinion polls, It's taking false comfort in abstractions. At such times, we learn what it means to be historical beings, that is, beings who have a past and who carry that inheritance into the present. One program author writes, "Since we happen to be the results of earlier generations, we are also the results of their aberrations, passions, errors, even crimes. It is not possible quite to free oneself from this chain." We thus came to wonder not just about the atrocious deed of others, but about ourselves and our own humanity. People questioned our traditions, our values, our world. It appeared that European culture had lost its footing. We faced, in short, the problem of restoring the health of a people which had become impaired by history. Looking back, the question was asked, what provided the grounds for those who made this life possible, the founders? Could the Jeffersonian hope or the Platonic dream concerning liberal education as the right defense against human disorder and conflict still stand? It was the conviction of Jefferson that if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. Further, he argued that the vulnerabilities and excesses of democracy needed to be moderated by liberal education, that we, quote, should be rendered by liberal education worthy to receive and able to guard a sacred deposit of the rights and liberties of our fellow citizens. But as one saw others and ourselves paralyzed before the impending war, this very conviction came into question. Was liberal education standing by us? And if not, how were we to reinvigorate those institutions that, it was once believed, were the bulwark against such threats? Why did liberal education disappear? The principles that changed American higher education were established in the early years of the past century. The university structure with its concomitant elective and lecture system. It had led to a convenience store conception of education, a system that serves every appetite except the most important one, the new learner. Co-opted by the professions, the elective system had over the years been complemented by fewer and fewer foundation or core courses. With no common curricula standing under these choices, we come away with no common foundation. As such, education no longer aimed to make us more thoughtful, more responsible, more human, but simpler, preoccupied with basic desires and skill training, oblivious to our neighbor, our future, and our deepest human potential. Thus, what looked like choice proved to be another empty word. Moreover, after years of sitting passively listening to others, one comes away, not surprisingly, a passive learner. Others talk at us, giving us prepackaged, pre-interpreted, and pre-digested information. But how can what is digested by others be nourishing for us? In the end, one of our program authors writes, modern man drags an immense amount of indigestible knowledge stones around with him. And because the fruits of others' thoughts are delivered to us without at the same time making us equally able to think those thoughts for ourselves, we come away not transformed nor enabled. The mode of acquisition being external, what we learn remains someone else's. In short, the original general functions of education were not being fulfilled. The plainest evidence of this was that one left the halls of academia with no developed sense of his or her potential. The existing system serving us well only if we accepted the reduction of the person to job skills. We are deprived of our utmost possibilities and our nation of its informing foundation. One had not been enabled. What then could be done? The same inspiration for St. John's declared, the times call for the establishment of a new college. But what would a college look like that sought to provide such an enabling education? To speak paradoxically, the new college would have a program that advocated primary education as opposed to derivative secondary education. It would seek above all to be freeing and as liberal by being an enabling education, making available to each of us both our individual intellectual resources and our intellectual inheritance. You would do this by re-enfranchising the learner, by making open discussion the arena of learning, and by seeking to create a habitual vision of greatness by having us cut our teeth on the best our traditions have to offer. Let me mention one fact concerning education. No matter how good one's professor, no matter even how great a great book, no one else can learn for us. Indeed, Plato went so far in his dialogue, Meno, to seek to demonstrate that teaching is impossible. This is not to say that learning is not possible. Quite the contrary. It is the learner, then, not the knower, that has to be the proper focus of our pedagogic efforts. Above all, learning is an activity, and as an activity is only actualized by the doing of it. Hence, for us, it becomes the question, not the answer, that should be its principal instrument. So, too, the focus is on the arts of acquisition, the arts of reflection and discovery that traditionally are called the liberal arts. These are all in the service of habits of originality, non-dependence, and deepened self-resourcefulness. Only then do we become active agents in our own education. Here, others may be of assistance, but as guides, not professors, the advanced learner modeling the virtues of openness, patience, perseverance, and humility in the search for what is not time-bound. Moreover, what is conspicuous about this form of education is its lack of lectures, except this one. By design, we refuse to talk down, to categorize, to have someone decide beforehand how what is to be discussed is to be discussed. Equally problematic, a lecture often presents us only with the results of someone's thinking and not with the process itself that led to those results. This leads to the curious circumstance that knowledge is often decoupled from its origin, from discovery, from the vital, originative questions that led thereto. In short, from the process of learning. We end up with many questions, we end up with many answers, to be sure, but to questions that were never our own. But if we're interested in learning how to learn, and not just in what others have learned, then we have to focus our attention back on the conditions of learning, for it is the process that is enabling. The discussion mode has this additional, very important advantage. While thinking might in the end be a private matter, learning does benefit in a fundamental way from joint effort and mutuality. Let us learn together, Socrates says. Let us help each other articulate, clarify, review, and deepen our ideas. What we learn in the process of discussion is the primacy of the idea over our individual commitments, something difficult to learn by oneself, especially in a time such as ours of destructive partisanship. We learn that we sometimes have to forsake our self-interest and misbegotten ideas in favor of possibilities opened up by discussion. Aristotle says there are certain things, especially about ourselves, that we can only learn from others. Learning about the selflessness of learning may be one of those things. Only then are we open to to what is other, a fellow learner, a new idea, or the greatest of great books. We turn to great books then, not just because they were once meaning-giving and provided foundations for different ways of life. We're not interested in the past as past. We turn to them rather as that the encounter with them might do for us what they did for past generations. We turn to them as world creators, that they might aid us in understanding the world they were instrumental in bringing about. We turn to them as well that we might confront the whole of our world, not just some prematurely narrowed disciplinary outlook. We turn to them further to face the great errors as well as the great truths. On the one hand, that they might provide a model for thinking well and deeply, aiding us as we seek to shape a world for our children. On the other hand, that they provide us with an opportunity to think differently, in the thinking through of which the determinate negation might provide us with a hint where thought might otherwise lead. In short, we turn to them to engage our deepest inheritance. Consideration of these originative authors, moreover, places us at a unique vantage point, at the point of the emergence of an idea when a question is still vital, not yet bound by inherited or disciplinary fences, and can still serve as living models of deep inquiry where fundamental presuppositions come into question. Lastly, we turn to great books because they give us an opportunity to unabashedly think great thoughts, thoughts that seem least time-bound. If you live yourselves in the history of great authors, the same program author writes, you will learn from it a highest commandment, to become right yourselves and to flee the paralyzing educational constraints of the age. We thus seek to join thinkers at the height of their humanness as they seek intimations of something more than transitory. An encounter with the fullest and deepest of our traditions promises much. That by exercising our minds unmediated with the most challenging thinkers, we might develop proportionately. That by experience original thought in the making, our capacities for original thought too might be inspired. That is, as we are taken to new heights, we might discover places where we have not gone before and develop new capacities to ascend thereto. That in facing the toughest of the tough human questions, we might thereby be strengthened. That as we are introduced to the whole range of what our authors deem worthy of responsibility, so will our own sense of responsibility grow. That in learning how very complex the world and its correlate, the world of thought, is, so we might be brought to become ever more self-resourceful. And lastly, in doing all this ourselves, we might, in the most profound way, achieve a heightened fullness of independence hitherto unrealized. This is the promise of a liberal education such as ours. It remains for us to make it real. And so we ask you this afternoon to join us in our efforts not to allow the past to be unreflectively perpetuated and to pledge yourselves anew to the unfinished work that these authors so nobly began. Thank you.
It's good to be back at my second home. I received my diploma a few feet to the right of the waterfall in 1970, some handful of years ago. It's always a pleasure to come back. The modern world is certainly, before I start, let me just take this opportunity. I'm not going to get very many at this conference to thank our colleagues out here in Santa Fe. This has been a glorious occasion for all of us in Annapolis to come out and participate. We're grateful for the opportunity to do it, and we're so proud of the way this 50th celebration has come off. I know I speak for everyone in Annapolis, and I imagine for everyone in the audience, in expressing my gratitude and deep appreciation for everything that's been going on this weekend. Well, the modern world is certainly doing everything it can to make liberal education difficult to obtain. I suppose that it always was so. The pressures of the moment invariably seem so pressing that it's hard to remember the biblical injunction, sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. And even harder to keep one's eye on the goal of training one's mind, heart, and soul for the attainment of happiness, which is the ultimate end of liberal education, as the pursuit of happiness is our political birthright. I wish to examine a few of the rather practical demands upon higher education today, and then to close with an overarching challenge, a challenge to liberal education, in the hope that I may turn a largely pessimistic task into an opportunity for all who care about liberal education. One of the most insistent of these demands is the nearly universal call for a reduction in the cost of education. To most people, this means a reduction in the price being paid by students and their families. And while we'd all like to pay less for the things we want and need, this demand fails to recognize that colleges have done a remarkable job of containing costs. In the first place, at our not-for-profit colleges, no one actually pays for the full cost of their education, even if they pay the full list price, because the costs are subsidized by government support, endowment income, gifts from alumni, friends, corporations, and foundations. Second, the inflation-adjusted price of attending colleges at most independent colleges has, on average, actually remained stable or dropped over the last decade due to generous financial aid programs. This has occurred despite the recent uncertainty in our investment returns, fundraising challenges, and sharp increases in financial aid as a result of the Great Recession. Third, many colleges have cut or frozen staffing and compensation as well in order to reduce those costs. So colleges have in fact responded aggressively to the demand to reduce costs, although this fact seems not to be well appreciated by the press, by our political leadership, or by the families of college-bound students who in increasing numbers are allowing price more than quality of educational offering to shape their choice of college. Another demand that threatens higher education is the demand for ever more assessment of student learning and assessment of the colleges that provide learning opportunities. In higher education circles, there's something of a feeding frenzy surrounding the issue of assessment. The federal government wants assessments that will allow it to compare colleges and universities that provide value. Accrediting organizations want assessments of student learning outcomes. State agencies want assessments to prove that tax dollars are being spent efficiently. Institutions want internal assessments that they can use to demonstrate success to their own communities. But the main purpose of most of this assessment is to determine whether an institution effectively delivers knowledge to its students, as though teaching and learning were a transaction, like a commodity exchange. This view of education very much downplays the role of the students in their own education. And I share Mr. Levine's view that no matter how good one's professor, no matter how great the learning material, no one else can learn for you. Learning belongs to the student. And if there's anything that's effective at St. John's College, it's learning. This is because the learner is at the center of learning. Current assessment models, it seems to me, habitually, almost obsessionally understate the responsibility of the student for his or her own learning. And what's more consequential, overstate the responsibility of the teacher. Teachers are directed to provide clear written statements of observable learning outcomes, to design courses which students have the opportunity to achieve the outcomes, to assess whether students achieve those outcomes, and to use the assessments of students to improve the courses so that attainment of the prescribed outcomes is enhanced. The standards do not entirely remove the student from as an agent. The course does provide an opportunity, while the student must achieve the outcomes. But the assessment procedures prescribe in advance the outcomes for the student. The student can achieve nothing of significance as far as the assessment is concerned, except what the professor preordains. This is mechanical and illiberal exercise. If the student fails to attain the end, is it because the professor has not provided a sufficient opportunity, or because the student in his or her freedom hasn't acted, or heaven forbid, because the student has, upon reflection, rejected the outcome desired by the teacher in favor of another? The assessment procedure accurately measures the effectiveness of the curriculum precisely to the extent that the student's personal freedom is discounted. True learning is not about having the right answer. So measuring whether students have the right answers is at best incidental to the essential aims of education. True learning is about mastering the art of asking questions and seeking answers and applying that mastery to your own life. It's about developing the power of self-transformation, or perhaps I should say, in the case of our young, to self-formations, and so many of our young have yet to develop the self, to be transformed. But it is this shaping of the self, this self-determination, that is the single most valuable ability one can have for meeting the demands of the ever-changing world in which we live. Meaningful assessment has to find a way of measuring attainment in these areas rather than those best adapted to the economic metaphor. The way to judge whether students have attained the sort of freedom that can be acquired by study is simply to demand that they undertake and successfully complete an intellectual investigation on their own. We do this in virtually every piece of writing required of our students in every class at St. John's College, and we do it in our classroom conversations and laboratories as well. The regular practice of undertaking these independent investigations, we hope, will become a habit that our alumni will use as a matter of course throughout their lives. This independence will empower them to meet the challenges of life and work, and it will help them to shape lives worth living, arrived at through thoughtful exploration of the question of just what kind of life they want to make for themselves. On the whole, higher education would do well to repurpose most of the money being spent on assessment. Use it instead to do away with the large lecture class, the very embodiment of information transfer, or education as commodity, so that students can have serious discussions with teachers, and teachers can practice the kind of continuous assessment that really matters in helping students to meet the responsibility of their own learning. But when there are lectures, let them be stimuli for serious conversations so that students can appropriate what belongs to themselves as they thoughtfully sift through what they've heard. A related demand that threatens liberal education is the demand for a national college ratings program. The current government plan for improving higher education depends greatly on developing a ratings plan to determine which colleges offer best value. Value will have price and cost as factors in determining the ratings. This sort of rating system will certainly produce unintended and detrimental consequences for liberal education. To the extent that the value of an education is measured in monetary terms by such factors as cost, price, future earnings, loan indebtedness, it fundamentally mischaracterizes the nature of higher education. The highest learning, the kind that helps you to become the owner of your own life, is not a commodity any more than your life is a commodity. To measure the value of an education largely in terms of its price of entry, or its economic return, is to be complicit in the ongoing cheapening of higher education. To the extent that value is not measured in economic terms, it will be extremely difficult to find a common standard for determining the value of an education, since students weigh so many different factors in choosing a college suited to their individual needs. Ratings of any kind suggest that all students are or ought to be looking for the same kind of thing from a college education. It also assumes that colleges are more alike than they actually are. better instead to find ways of getting as much information as possible about each school to each student, and let them make their own ratings, the ones that will suit their own individual needs. Only freely educated citizens, freely pursuing their own paths to a life worth living, can shape a society that will protect the lives and promote the happiness of all. This statement ought to be the basis of all public policy in this area, and I think it explains the success of the Pell Grant program, which has resulted in a leveraging of federal dollars to give students from all walks of life a real opportunity to exercise their choices freely within the broad range of accredited schools. After discussing these demands, all relating in some way to the commodification of higher education, let me now mention a challenge, probably the most pressing challenge that we liberal arts colleges face: persuading our institutions, the press, the public, that society desperately needs our kind of education. Here I could say a few encouraging words about what we might together begin to turn the tide of opposition to liberal education. The world seems to be approaching an inflection point in its previously insatiable demand for more and more specialized knowledge. Today it's clamoring not only for intelligence and specific expertise, but also for ingenuity and the ability to connect disparate areas of experience. Those who do not recognize the liberal arts as the province of ingenuity and interconnectedness seem to believe that these demands can be met by following the very course that led to the uninventiveness and fragmentation in the first place, namely by pursuing more specialization. If we just do enough research, they seem to think, perhaps we could come up with a checklist or a training program or a college curriculum that would deliver the ingenuity and integrated thinking that we want. This blind spot for anything that does not fit the research paradigm, which has been growing for something like 200 years, prevents the world from seeing that the solution already exists and has existed for millennia. The human faculty that makes ingenuity and interconnection possible is imagination. And developing imagination in all its forms is the proper excellence of the liberal arts. Through repeated encounters with the greatest writings and artworks of the past in literature, philosophy, mathematics, science, history, ethics, politics, music, painting, sculpture, dance, and on, we become accustomed to the habits of imagination that enable our most talented predecessors to conceive boldly, to invent what did not yet exist, to recreate both themselves and the world around them. To reinvent the world in the face of modern challenges, we need to reinvent imagination through liberal education. But the world cannot see this because liberal education is situated precisely in that blind spot. And most of the current arguments in defense of liberal education ignore this blind spot. We try to persuade those who see no practical benefits of liberal education that it has higher aims: broad learning, development of character, and preparation for citizenship. But these aims are incompatible with the research paradigm and fall squarely in the world's blind spot. For the intended audience, this rhetoric makes insubstantial noises that seem to come from no one and from nowhere. I'll say something a little strange now, I think. We must stop defending liberal education in this way. As Hunter Rawlings has recently suggested, we should stop defending liberal education altogether. The rhetorical task that faces us is not to make the world see something that it cannot see, but to point to something in its blind spot so clearly that its existence cannot be denied, even if it is invisible. Fortunately, liberal artists are good at rhetoric. We know how to hook an audience through its desires and then persuade them to follow. The world wants ingenuity and interconnectedness, then that's the place to start. Let us create beautiful and aspirational arguments leading from ingenuity and interconnectedness back to imagination and its guardian, liberal education. Let us abandon the defensive posture altogether and replace it with the confident bearing of a physician who knows the cure. Let us recreate the rhetorical landscape around the world's current desires. Let us devise a new repertory of innovation and attractive tropes that will succeed where the old defensive tropes have failed. Let us invent the positive rhetoric that will help us to shrink the world's blind spot so that it can begin to see liberal education rather than specialized education as the answer to its needs. I have no doubt that we liberal artists can do this. We're the offspring of godlike poets, the heirs to the most persuasive rhetors who ever lived. If we can summon a smattering of their inventiveness, tell our story with a fraction of their ardor, and forge fresh language suited to the dignity of our object, we can wean the world from its addiction to specialization, or at the very least in our high schools and in the early years of college, perhaps. But we must do it in concert. The attack on liberal education will not likely be turned back by individual efforts, no matter how ingenious. On the contrary, we must devise and deploy our alternate rhetorical idiom as a coordinated force. We must use that idiom almost to the exclusion of the other, refusing to speak in its terms. With persistence, if our vision is attractive enough, we will crowd out and eventually replace the world's idiom. Now, what will this rhetoric sound like? It will eschew the economic metaphors that distort the essence of learning and teaching, rejecting terms like value, investment, payoff, consumer, provider. And it will invariably and vigorously question the use of such terms so that the users may begin to suspect that they do have a blind spot. It will defer the old tropes about breadth, character, and citizenship, at least until we're certain that the blind spot has been diminished enough for our listeners to see where those arguments are coming from. And finally, its central collection of tropes will focus on imagination. Imagination is the source of ingenuity and interconnectedness. Imagination as the leader to be followed by specialization. Imagination as the priceless treasure protected and transmitted by the liberal arts. Let me close by saying that we proponents of liberal education are and have been for a long time implicated in bringing about the very threats that face us. We do not understand our situation very well if we portray it to ourselves as enlightened champions of liberal education facing uncomprehending hordes of venal politicians and careerist parents. The problem is cultural, and we advocates of liberal education are in part responsible for the uncomprehending hordes. Why do almost all of our politicians come from the ranks of lawyers, businessmen, and professional office seekers? Because of specialization. What societal institution is most responsible for extreme specialization? Higher education. To the extent that those of us involved in higher education have acquiesced to the historical trend toward ever-increasing specialization and ever-diminishing liberal learning, we are responsible for raising up people who are incapable of seeing beyond the blinders imposed by their specialties. Is it any wonder that such people do not understand liberal education or its importance to the individual and to humanity? The situation for liberal education will get better when integral citizens from all walks of life take an active part in all the institutions that nourish our democracy. No one can bring this about but us. So let's get to work. Thank you.
Thanks both of you for your
Would you all do me a favor? We've done this before. Could you say who you are and where you're coming from?
Of course. Yeah, my name is Jennifer Donnelly. I'm an alum, 1996, Annapolis, for 2 years in Santa Fe as well. And I also spoke at the conference a few days ago. I want to thank you both for your talks, and Mr. Levine, thank you for this historical context. The college is not really something I ever really thought about. And I think it's really important and bears repeating to our community. And thank you, Mr. Nelson, too, for your ongoing advocacy for the liberal arts for St. John. There's a question that's been building up over the last few days for me, which was also continuing to bubble up during both your presentations, and Mr. Nelson, you actually used the words high school and something else, which I've now forgotten. But anyway, the gist of it is that we've been focusing on higher education for the most part in all of our conversations over the last few days when we talk about programs and aims. And the other word that you mentioned was cultural. It's a cultural kind of problem. And it does seem to me that to expect to have a wide impact in the world starting at 18 years old when the students come to college, it seems limited in a way, and it seems like the work needs to start much earlier. And so I know that you all, everyone sitting at the table right now, has quite a lot of experience and thoughts about it, and you've thought about this. So I wonder whether you might just say some things about that, about how liberal, what a liberal education might mean at a younger age, at grade age before higher education, before your college. I mean, in a way, maybe K through 12 is liberal education because there are many subjects, but maybe it's not. And that's kind of that's the question that's forming, and anything you say would be helpful. Thanks, Matt.
Sure. I was asked once, maybe 15 years ago, to serve on a panel of education leaders and business leaders who were convinced that the answer to our problems was to have a seamlessness of education from pre-kindergarten to postdoctoral level stuff. I have to tell you, I was horrified because I thought that we in higher education would ruin the high schools if we did this. I actually have a greater respect for what the high schools are trying to do in providing a broader education than what we've been doing in colleges. And we've driven by our graduate schools and professional programs that ever more specialize in colleges. And I hear colleges talking to high school students even as early as sophomore year. You need to start specializing if you want to get into a program that will then get you into a graduate school or a professional school that will then get you into a career. I think that's all wrong. On the other hand, I also think that the worst thing we could be doing for our high school students is what we're doing now, which is turning to this kind of teach to the test mentality. So we're producing, I guess, in the most recent book on literature and higher education, excellent sheep. We're getting people who know how to take a test and spending a lot of money and learning how to do it. And they come to our colleges very well prepared to be told what they need to learn and then to learn that rather than develop their own capacities. I think it's a terrible thing. And it's suppressing both imagination and independence in our young. So I would very much like to see more of this pushed down into the elementary through high schools. And many schools are doing it. It's one of the nice things that we don't have a simply national system in any of these areas of education, that we have people who are helping the young to read books at a young age and to find ways of stirring the imagination, whether it's through the study of nature, out of doors, with experimental equipment at the laboratory table, or reading of books where they can see the richness of character and possibilities for themselves. I'd like to see more of that and speak more about that at the level.
Yeah, Stuart, first of all, the teachers in higher education every day have a greater and greater appreciation for secondary and primary education teachers. It is, when we talk about the liberal arts, I would like to emphasize that we're talking about both the subject matter and something that we call an art. And one of the things that we see in our graduates, as they, in quite a large proportion go on to teaching, is that they bring the St. John's approach to learning to the primary schools, to the secondary schools, and with huge success. They get awards for unique teaching and being innovative, and the problem of educations of ours, I can tell, is a puzzling one. Because, and this is something controversial, it's not as if we have to solve a possible for that kind of teaching to flourish. So, I'm not a historian, but I guess that's my function today. As a historical note, the Graduate Institute was originally entitled the Teachers Institute in liberal education. And the thought was we bring teachers to the college, and that will have its effect as they go back to their home schools, and then their students will become the recipients of the virtues of liberal education, even if they don't come to St. John's.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you,
Ms. Eagle, how are you?
Mr. Levine.
I see you.
Some of us here in this room right now are enrolled with Mr. Levine and Mr. Cornell, and our reading Monday night is Marx and Living Wages. So I picked up the Santa Fe Reporter, and on the cover says Stomp. And the lead article is about a master's from St. John's College. She also has a PhD in English. She's currently getting $28,500 a year. Her credit hours are being reduced as many faculty are now turning to part-time faculty in order to reduce the need, or to eliminate the need to pay benefits, health insurance. And with the Obamacare, well, let's just remove that, reduce the hours she teaches, we don't need to worry about that either. In fact, in this particular article, a woman is teaching French for 25 years, no severance pay, no pension, and she dies in abject poverty. So one of the lines that you hear is, how can we help our students, enable them to believe in what they're learning when the faculty members themselves are living in poverty? My second part, and kind of piggyback on that, is I come from California. Our very best professors are being stolen by corporations. And fewer professors are getting full tenure. In fact, if it's politically volatile, they are guaranteed not to get tenure. Can you address some of these issues?
It's a scandal. It's as simple as that, I think. I heard in one of the speeches yesterday, so I take it at face value that National Liberal Arts College is the only segment in higher education today that still has a majority of its faculty as full-time teaching faculty. Now, I know you're speaking at faculty at a high school level, which makes it even sadder and worse. But that we're doing this to ourselves in higher education, where we clearly should know better and have more resources than some of these school districts do, I think is equally a scandal. I'm going to let somebody else take the next stage while I think about what is the best solution to that kind of thing. I mean, we've all been struggling with this as voters, and I don't want to stumble into it. So I'm going to think about it a little bit and see if others have something they want to say.
I can only second the notion that it's a scandal. And it's clear from that the founders thought that education had to be at the heart of our community. And that it's made, that it's not, that it's disparaged, that it's under-rewarded, that's not recognized. It's a scandal.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I suppose that the only way this sort of problem gets resolved is when the voters come to recognize that education has the value that we claim that it does. How can it be that we have so devalued our education? It's possible that we speak that way because we only see education in economic terms. So what's the natural response when we got an economic problem? We cut the economic balance sheet. If we can understand the importance, the value of education for our liberty, our individual growth, our nation's health, maybe people will start to respect better the need to pay a living wage to our teachers. I think the only way you can do that is on a full-scale coordinated assault on public opinion. But maybe Tom Slakey has an answer to this.
Tom, please.
I don't have an answer, and I'm not well enough informed to make this assertion, but I do think that the teaching profession itself, there's a large measure of responsibility for this. the working conditions and salaries of professors at the top levels in American universities have gotten considerably better and more generous over these years, while the conditions of the adjunct teaching people who do most of, or a very large part of the teaching, have gotten steadily worse. I think the profession itself bears a large measure of responsibility for this situation. As you said, Chris, it's a scandal. I think as a profession we should be ashamed of ourselves.
I think that's correct. Exactly what's happening with the separation of the people of great wealth and the rest of the country in the general population is happening at an ever-expanding rate in higher education and, well, in education generally. It's true in high school circles. There are schools which are paying high six-figure salaries to high school teachers in some school districts, and others that are getting $25,000 a year.
Tom?
I think it's somewhat analogous to the condition of baseball players and actors and people like that. The people at the top make huge amounts of money. Most people at the bottom barely survive.
Yes, ma'am.
Boston University. I just wanted to respond a little bit because I actually think that the incredible prices of tuition now in a lot of universities, I mean, I guess I'm going to speak about private R1, research one universities, comes from the expansion of the university itself. Mostly, not salaries. Even for those people who are getting paid very inflated salaries, who often maybe even teach only one semester, there are some of those people, but I don't think it's largely that is causing the expense. I think it's the building of buildings, many of which are not actually academically, they don't serve an academic function. They're either student accommodation buildings or fitness centers or other things of that ilk. In fact, often those buildings have to be paid for subsequently, and they have to be paid for continually. It's not as though you're done once you put the building up. It's that, and it's administration, the expanse of the administrative ranks. Those people command much higher salaries in general than the faculty do. And there have been many, many more of them, I think probably in the past decade. Just measure the number of hyphens in somebody's title to see how there was one position and now there are four, say, the assistant vice provost of this or that or the other. And often you don't even know what someone's title means because it's not descriptive of any role that they fill. They don't come from the ranks of our faculty. They come from somewhere else, either another institution. I'm not exactly sure where they come from actually, but they don't come from the ranks of the faculty by and large, and they're usually career administrators. And of course, the more services and facilities that the universities feel that they need to offer students in order to compete with their peer institutions mean that they have to have a voluminous amount of additional staff in order to, say, offer 24-hour libraries, or in Boston we have 24-hour food for students in the middle of the city of Boston from campus. So they could be getting that from the city of Boston. It's not in the middle of nowhere. But the reason the university is offering it is because they feel very strongly that the parents of the students who would attend the university, the prospective students, demand that. And if they don't offer that, they will not come to Boston University. They'll go to a competitive peer institution. And it feels like that's a lot of what accounts for the rise in tuition. So it's nothing is free, everything is included.
Yes, ma'am.
Leslie Lewis, class of '82, Annapolis, and 20-year literature professor, but currently a dean of humanities and sciences at Tutor College, and therefore, in some ways, one of those administrators. However, someone who really looks at administration as a service obligation. I think it's very important that the conversation has turned to money, and Chris, thank you for setting up part of this conversation in terms of talking about the commodification of education. What I guess I would ask us to do is to use our imagination to think of different models. To the extent that education is so often talked about in terms of business metaphors, we fall into, I think, very bad habits of thinking about what it is we're doing. And so my question really is what other kinds of models and metaphors are out there. I'm a 20-plus year organic gardener, so one of the metaphors that I am thinking a lot about, very honestly, is sustainable agriculture. But there could be many others. It seems to me that we know that we're an intentional community of a certain kind, each of us, in our various colleges and universities. And so, I wonder about that as a possibility. But I think without question, for all of us, it's an imperative that we follow the money in our institutions, that we understand very thoroughly where the money is coming from to run the institution that we're in. It's different, and sometimes it's very different in different places. But right now, it seems absolutely of paramount importance to understand this piece. But again, my question is, are there other metaphors? Are there other models?
Yeah.
Is there another language that we can
No,
appropriate?
when I spoke about using the language of imagination or the need to develop an imagination, that's what I would be talking about. Think about, I'll give you 3 examples. All of our freshmen have now either are approaching or read a portion of these 3 books. Euclid's Elements, Homer's Odyssey, and Plato's Republic. Each of these books is filled with riches for the imagination. In Euclid's Elements, a point is that which has no part. A line has breadthless length. These things don't exist. They're not palpable in the real world. They only exist in the imagination. Suddenly, Euclid is taking us from a world that we think of as a practical application in a world of things to association in the imagination, and all of that geometry and that mathematics is just that kind of thing. It's the application of imagination to other things, and it takes us to another plane. If you take Odysseus, probably the character in all of literature with the richest imagination and the multifarious ways that he has to get out of his troubles. He may land alone with no friends left and another group of enemies to battle when he lands on the shores of Ithaca. But this is a man who has exercised his imagination. His storytelling can be our storytelling. We ought to be able to learn to tell those stories. So when we talk to people, we ought to be able to use the language of our own literature, the language of our books. Take the Republic. You've got, in Book 2, the Ring of Gyges, moves quickly to the city of pigs. You've got philosopher kings and guardians. Then you've got the sun, kind of an unmoved mover, the source of all that is in the world and the source of illumination as well. That's not quite enough, can't reach it, hard to get to. So let's take the divided line as a geometric image in the imagination. And then let's move to a drama, an imagination of how one is chained in a cave and gets to climb out. Our literature is filled with this sort of thing. It ended with a myth of Ur. We have stories, we have myths, we have images. If we talk about our education in this way, and talk about the excitement we can get when we explain what goes on in the unchaining of an individual and dragging them up that rocky slope and into the light of the sun where they can see the world as it really is, this is an exciting adventure. It's that kind of thing that I'm talking about. It's the stories that we have in our collective historical memory, and ones that throughout the program of any good liberal arts college that provide all the riches we need to tell the public what they're not seeing and how to shrink that blind spot. It's to shape the richness of what this education can do. That's the kind of thing that's where I was going.
Just a small point, and that is, historically, we've not been, at St. John's, we've not been hugely successful talking about ourselves. But where we are successful is allowing people to see what we do and who we are. So people will visit the campus and inquire, having read our various pieces of literature. But what's really convincing isn't anything we say, but what we do. They visit classes, and then they're caught. And so I think that's been our experience over the years. We've been trying in various ways to have more attractive literature, but on the real thing, I think, to see the life of the college, to see the life of learning, is to be there. I mean, we have people visiting our classes who have to restrain themselves because they want to be part of this life. And so that's I think, I don't know how to make that a public or shared experience, but that's where I think we're most successful.
Go over here and then back in the back hill.
Scott Lee, Association for Cortex and Courses. I want to actually just piggyback on this most recent discussion because I think really in a different way what's being talked about, whether it be through the imagination or whether it be through visits, is really kind of being able, in a way, if you wish, to see or experience the liberal arts. That's the biggest persuasiveness that we can have. I would suggest that taking the words art, artist, and thinking seriously about the arts and artistry that we practice is one way to begin to really bring this alive. I would suggest that a co-curricular array of activities that students are engaged in, which actually feeds into the curriculum and then feeds out, rather than running parallel, is a huge way to enliven and exemplify what it is that we're doing. And finally, actually, Mr. Levine, I would suggest that not everybody can come to campus, but students can see parents, and parents can see prospectives sitting around watching a seminar go on even something like YouTube.
Yep.
And widely broadcast, and by every college, not just St. John's. This might go a long ways.
And I've always wondered why we've not been able to make that jump into the virtual world.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Chris Deming, alumnus, now at St. John's University, New York City. In a recent book by Frank Donahue called The Last Professors, The Corporate University and the Fate of the Humanities, he actually makes the case that the outlook for liberal education in the humanities might be better than the outlook for the traditional four-year university, and that there might be a point in the near future where practitioners of the liberal arts might do better to decamp from the university structure as it's developed than to hang around and just, get paid poverty wages to teach people how to write business memos later in life. So I wanted to get the panelists' opinion. Do you think that there might come a point when those people who want to support liberal education should be willing to look beyond colleges and universities? I mean, I think of some of the experimental ideas of people like Scott Buchanan.
I was testifying, or I was waiting to testify last year at the Maryland legislature when the president or the chancellor of the University of Maryland went to the podium to seek $60 million for 3 new lecture halls because they didn't have large enough lecture halls at the university. I couldn't think of a worse use for $60 million because those lectures are all going to be delivered online, and the universities know that. There's going to be a part of our educational programming that's simply going to disappear from a traditional four-year program. I'm convinced of that. If we're talking about information transfer, a lot of that can happen more effectively, more efficiently, and with the kind of expertise that we may need at some point when we're looking at specialization, when we've got some kind of a basic education underneath us. So I think that a lot of universities are getting that point, and they're scared, and they're bringing in liberal arts into their curriculum, just when a lot of liberal arts colleges are running to have specialized programs in vocational education. We've got to be very careful of ourselves. I read a study, David Brenneman, I think it was, did a study in 1991, came up with a very peculiar formula, but identified 210 liberal arts colleges in the United States that were still teaching liberal arts, and it had something to do with 70% of the curriculum was in the traditional arts and sciences taught by full-time faculty. By 2010, that number had dropped to 113, something like that. Georgia It's not inside on, right? We're doing it to ourselves what we have been criticizing the universities to be in danger of doing, and they're trying to pick up a little bit on what we've done right. So I think you're right, Chris. Long term, we should have the answer to this. We should be the bastion for the savior of higher education, but we've got to stay the course, and we've got to persuade people that what we're doing is useful as well as good in itself.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is I think it's important for us to continue to make the case for the residential college, because it is probably the case that at a research university you can spin off X number of professors and a few students and sit under a tree and contemplate Newton. But what makes it, what reinforces everything that we do here in the classroom is what happens outside the classroom and the community itself. And that's something that we really have to protect, and we have to argue forcefully for, and to remind parents and others that of the value that comes from the experience of an 18-year-old spending 4 years away from their family in another community and learning to be a citizen in that community. And that is very difficult to replicate in any other kind of way other than what I see here, especially here at St. John's, where that sense of of the lack of boundaries between the classroom and outside the classroom is so important.
I don't know who you are back there. Christine. Oh, right. I gather you're alluding to the origins of the college in forms such as adult education in Cooper Union in New York, or at the YMHA or YMCA in New York, where there was this felt need to come together and talk about important things. And that led up to the college. The difficulty now is that we exist not quite in a vacuum, but we don't have the supporting cultural interest that was the original foundation and feeder for the Great Books program. So it's especially difficult. But as someone pointed out in a conversation the other day, St. John's is the only college that he knew where our graduates get together and talk about books in 20 different cities around the world.
Hi, my name is Franklin Wu. I'm accredited as an officer of a small police liberal college that just started 2 years ago. We're setting out all required curriculum, much like St. John's model. So, I mean, I wanted to ask a question to President Nelson to talk about accreditation and the pressure to assessment. You know, I think all of us in that realm of things all keenly felt that kind of pressure because it happens to us all the time. I have conversations with Ms. Howard, that she has to go through with accreditation. It's not just assessment, but also faculty qualification, this kind of stuff. So for us new institutions that didn't have track record or history, we have to kind of go through the gate and sort of things like that. But even St. John's would have to go through doing it as a career accreditation process. So is there any thought, what kind of strategy do you guys use? I know there was a time when there was a formation of the American Academy of Liberal Education as a national accreditation body for liberal arts colleges. You know, where is that going? Is it up to go back to that more, or what kind of colleges?
Yeah, accreditation is under huge pressure and attack from the press, from government agencies, and maybe from a lot of other parental groups. There's a sense that higher education isn't doing what it ought to be doing, and therefore it must be the fault of the accreditors, allowing them to continue in existence. I don't take most of that as seriously as many of my colleagues do. I think the accreditation system is working very, very well for the small liberal arts colleges. I don't know how it can work particularly effectively with the giant universities, but it allows us a chance to assess our strengths and weaknesses, be honest with it, and to improve and to acknowledge that we need improvement rather than to just have to check boxes that we satisfy and all these things. So that said, my sense is that the accrediting agencies are responding to this national pressure by tightening the screws, doing just the thing that I think is going to hurt it's going to damage the very virtues that they have, because they've got to satisfy this public thirst for killing another institution. And I think that's what it comes down to. So I think it's a very difficult challenge that you have. What state are you in?
California.
Yeah, so, well, California has the virtue of having a lot of non-accredited institutions in it, I suppose. And you probably got some friends. Go to your friends. I mean, there are people who want to see you survive. People like us would like to see a school that's doing the things you say you're doing survive, and ask us for some help with those accreditors and help and give you some advice on how we go through our checklist and our assessment procedures. It's a challenge for us. I don't accept some of the standards, but I have to, because it's the gateway to all federal financial aid for our students. It's the gateway for our graduates to get into graduate school, professional schools, and in some cases even to get jobs that they have to graduate from accredited schools. So what we need to do is find the schools that care about what you're doing, band together and help each other do the things that are necessary, that won't hurt the things that are essential. I guess that's all I can say. I talk to a lot of schools that do this sort of thing and try to find ways to help them.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Dan. I'm enrolled in the Graduate Institute at the moment here in Santa Fe. Mr. Levine, you mentioned how Johnnies get together and read books after they graduate. And yesterday, Ms. Bronder, in her talk, beautifully suggested that an alumnus's mission after graduation should be to read a book with someone in the community. I wonder, and it may seem ideal or naive, I wonder about the possibility of harnessing the alumni network to run many recruitment centers across the country and to bring the seminar experience to potential students. Because as you said, Mr. Levine, that the experience of seminar is such a powerful recruiting tool. It seems that, you know, internet, we live in an age in which computers make it tempting to think that there's going to be a quick and easy way to reach people. Reaching people with seminars run by alumni across the country might not be easy, but it might actually work if enough people dug in and did it.
Sounds great.
Well, and I should also say that we are trying to do a better job of harnessing the power of our alumni on both of our campuses. We've got someone in the admissions office whose focus is to work with the alumni and work, through a variety of ways to try to help with recruiting. As those of you who've hung around me know enough, what I'm constantly saying is that St. John's College is a word-of-mouth college. It is the way most people learn about us, through others who have had that experience themselves. And we've got to really continue to work to try to harness those voices that we have that can help tell our story effectively.
Yeah, as anyone who's been involved with not-for-profit organizations know, harnessing volunteers is difficult, but it requires staff and expenditures. We didn't invest in that over the decades as much as we ought to have. This last year in Annapolis alone, we had assistance from 250 of our alumni to help recruit the class of 138 that we brought in. Santa Fe has another number of people helping, and we now have sought and received support from a significant donor to help us hire the staff in the offices simply to support the alumni effort. And we also know some of you from San Diego area. I mean, there we have an alumnus doing just what you're talking about through libraries and local schools, running seminars.
San Antonio.
Did I what did I say?
San Diego.
Oh, no, I'm San Antonio. And he's been doing just this kind of thing that you're talking about. And I think it's proving to us that it's worth doing. And I think it was just last week we sent someone down from the admissions office. Was that right, Bill? to help and support it there. That's one. We could use a lot more.
Yes, sir.
Hey, my name's Peter, and I'm doing the graduate program, Mr. Levine. I'm a high school teacher.
Are all these acolytes of Mr. Levine in here?
I have two daughters, both in schools that claim to be liberal arts colleges. And I wonder about the word outcome, and if that's a word that you would disallow, or if not, in what sense, you know, it could be used. I'm going back to my school. My kids go to college, the kids I teach, and you know, parents want to know. Even liberal arts schools like Wellesley, for example, where my daughter attends, they're really good at talking about what's seen both pragmatic and ideological outcomes. Anyway, outcomes.
I hate the word, I hate the image. And the reason is that, again, it fits that economic metaphor. And it puts us into, there's input, there's value added, there's outcome, and improved product, basically. On the other hand, if what they mean is, show us what your alumni are doing, that we should be doing. We should show with all their glory the wonderful things that our alumni are doing. We don't have to call them outputs. Frankly, they're human beings, and they're not part of an industrial complex, at least not internally. And if they're talking about scores and rankings and ratings, well, you kind of heard what I think about those. I think they drive us to achieve well the things that matter least. And so I don't want to use the language because it's easy to devise a test that everybody can pass and that everybody knows how to pass. It's very hard to make a life and to build a sense of independence and self-direction. And those are the kinds of things that I'd be talking about. It's hard to put that into a language of quantification, into counting terms, I guess.
You know, the only thing, what I've come to describe what we hope for our graduates is that they will live lives of meaning and contribution. And I think, and that contribution can be in a whole variety of ways. Many of them, probably the most important ones, aren't going to be in their job necessarily. And that's the kind of outcome, of result, if you will, that I think that, at least for me, is the most comfortable in terms of trying to communicate to prospective students, parents, and those kind of things about what we aspire for, what we hope for in our students and in our graduates.
A bureaucratic question that I should know the answer to because of my own experience, but I don't. With the regional accrediting agencies, obviously in some way quasi-governmental agencies, more and more so, but they have members, the institutions. What role do the members of the institutions actually play in the structure of the governance of the accrediting agency?
Not much in my experience.
Formally, everything, but practically, the Department of Education is telling them what they have to do, and that's the problem we're facing. I didn't answer something that Chris Denny answered, but you triggered in my mind that. You asked about the American Academy of Liberal Education, which is one of those small accrediting organizations that isn't regional, but was national, and was designed for national liberal arts colleges. They had their certification to grant accreditation yanked by the Department of Education, and I think it was mostly to set an example to the big guys. There were some problems, and they could have solved those things, and they're still seeking the right to accredit institutions again. But we in Annapolis had dual accreditation 10 years ago. We couldn't seek it with them this year, and most of their membership now are secondary schools and overseas institutions where the Department of Education doesn't have to get involved. It's a sad story.
Yes, sir.
I'm also, I represent a Muslim liberal arts college. We're in our 5th year called Zaytuna College. I just was very happy to meet our colleague starting a Buddhist college about an hour away from us. Very interested to follow up on some of what you said about the different terms that you use and how you go through demonstrating outcomes, but in terms that are more in line with the educational philosophy at a liberal college. So I will follow up on that. My specific question is, do the two campuses at Annapolis and Santa Fe, are they accredited by the same institute, so it's different? I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Well, you'll be pleased to know that Santa Fe is in the north central part of the United States.
We are accredited, we in Santa Fe are accredited by the North Central, the Higher Learning Commission, North Central, which runs all the way from West Virginia to us, and Annapolis is in middle states. So we go through accreditation separately. Annapolis, right, which gets extremely interesting when it comes time to explain to the accreditors what we're doing as a college and what we're doing as a campus and how that works.
Yeah, there was a time when accrediting standards in these regional organizations were quite different. It's just not true today because of the press from Washington. So while there are differences, and certainly differences in practice, the standards are looking more and more alike in the regional institutions. So what's going on in one region is very likely to be kind of thing you'll see in another region, and that's why I think if you find friends, whether they're in the western region or not, they may be able to help provide a little advice. By the way, my reference to the kinds of outcomes, that is, lives our alumni are leaving, that's not going to satisfy our accreditors. But we use other tools that we don't think are going to hurt our educational mission. The last thing they want to do is set a standard and then have them say, okay, now what are you going to do to improve on that test score or on that GRE exam score or on the number of PhDs that you're awarding or whatever standard you decide to measure yourself against. The next question is, okay, now what are you going to do to get better? And of course, that's not what we're trying to do. So you have to be very careful in setting your standards, because the next question will always be, all right, everybody can do better against that standard. Show us what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and then prove it the next time around. So that's the battle we're facing with assessment.
And it's changed. It's changed in the last 15 years. When we did, when I was director of the GI, we were undergoing accreditation. And in those days, this is before the new regime, I guess, in Washington, but in those days, the people looking at our graduate program were faculty from Notre Dame. And they just loved us. You know, they were taking their own programs had taken inspiration from what we do here. Whereas now it just seems like it's so much more administrative speak and quantitative outcomes that it's hard for me to recognize that this is accreditation anymore.
I should give one positive plug to accrediting agencies. One of the reasons that we have this conference is because when we went through our last accreditation, our accreditor said, you guys don't give yourselves enough credit. You don't help set the standard for others and be an example. You need to be out there more and doing it. So that's why we're all here, partly. We have time for one last question, I think.
Gordon Lockwood, Department of Philosophy at Quinnipiac University. So again, forgive me for, I know this is like a naive question. It seems to me one of the worst things that's happened in higher ed is this problem of contingent labor. And you were pointing out, colleges seem to be one of the last places where again, you're not bringing in adjuncts and so on and so forth. The naive question, if contingent labor is such a huge problem in higher ed, how does that slip through the sort of radar of accrediting agencies? Do they even care that I mean, you have 7% of student body that's being taught by non-tenured, not even full-time faculty, or is having contingent labor fine with accrediting agencies?
Yeah, we don't have any, and so we haven't faced it directly. I don't know the answer to that. It's a very good question. It ought to be the question they're asking. And maybe you know, Scott. I don't know if we have others in here.
Claudia, maybe you can speak to this. Claudia Howard, who's been working with the Higher Learning Commission for us, and correct me if I'm wrong, Claudia, that one of the questions that the Higher Learning Commission is really asking us is, are your, they would say, professors qualified to be teaching the courses that they're teaching. And that is, of course, a huge challenge for us because our tutors teach across the curriculum. Claudia, can you embellish on that a little bit?
Well, I mean, like what you guys said, I mean, I think it's a scandal the way accreditation is turned to a quantitative, but I just wanted to follow up too, because my point of view on the peer review core, I do feel this is an area where we have abdicated our responsibility. Part of the reason that the teams that visit your campus to accredit you or to hopefully give you initial accreditation are packed full of vice presidents, provosts, assistant vice presidents, is because the faculty have not stepped up to the volunteer call to train and serve in the peer review system in the Higher Learning Commission. And I won't deny that there's also a certain top-down pressure coming out of the DOE, but I do want to encourage those of you who are scandalized to consider having some of your faculty volunteer and get on the core and get out there and come to visit Franklin's institution and laud him for the work he's doing as well.
Okay, quick last.
It's more just a comment that this issue of qualification is extremely important. SACS in particular is disqualifying people from teaching certain courses, and this particularly threatens liberal arts, cortex, grade books kind of programming. It's something that has to be really, really paid attention to, and the faculty solution that you're talking about is extraordinarily important in this case, because what it really amounts to is you have people who understand what the education is about, that are doing the accrediting. There's one other final anecdote. Out of Middle States, I think it is. Isn't Princeton in Middle States? Accredited, it's not a hopeless case. Accreditors went to Princeton, and believe me, somebody on the board of Middle States has said this. Okay, it could be. We'll let it go at that. Went to Princeton, and they demanded proof of the quality of a Princeton education. And they literally, Princeton had a room of theses, right? Go ahead, inspect it, see for yourself. And one of the people, this is how out of touch we're talking about, said, no, where's all your quantitative data? This is what every other institution gives me. Why don't, well, you know, Middle States heard about this, okay? But that gives you hope. That's the reason for telling this story, is that really the quality of the education actually does matter. And you've got to be in a position to be able to argue for it with the not just the accreditors, but even the governing bodies of the accreditation agencies.
Well, thank you all for being here and joining us.